Good afternoon. Today and tomorrow I want to talk about the Passion Gospel. Why 2 days? Well, first of all, this is the longest gospel of the church year. And second, and much more important, is there are a lot of details in this gospel, and I think it's important for us to understand the whole story of Holy Week. And so we read from the Gospel of Matthew, starting in the 26th chapter and the 14th verse on this Sunday. And we begin with a story of Judas going to the temple authorities in Jerusalem and setting the wheels in motion to betray Jesus. He makes a deal with the temple authorities, who we know have been looking for a way to arrest Jesus. And for 30 pieces of silver, we don't know how much that was worth exactly in Jesus' day, but it was probably a pretty significant sum of money. Judas promises to betray Jesus at the right time so he can be arrested. We don't know why Judas does this. Some theologians have said perhaps it was because he was greedy and he wanted the money. Others have suggested that he became convinced that Jesus wanted to die as a martyr for the cause. But I think what we really have to do is just be content with believing that we don't know, and it's not really important why, but that Judas did set these wheels in motion to betray Jesus. Now, at this point, we move forward to the day before the Feast of the Passover. This was a big event in Jerusalem. People came from all over. They brought in more Roman troops and guards because of the large crowds that would gather in Jerusalem. And so on this particular day, Jesus is back in Bethany, by the way. After the triumphal entry into the city, they went back to Bethany where Mary, Martha, and Lazarus lived. And now Jesus sends two of his disciples to find the place where they will celebrate the Passover meal. This is what we will often hear about today as a Seder. I don't know if you've ever participated in a Seder, but it is a very structured dinner. And certain things are done at certain times to remember the deliverance from Egypt, the chosen people's deliverance from Egypt, the wandering in the wilderness, and the gift of the promised land. And so you do certain things at certain times, you eat certain things at certain times, and that's important to the story, and it takes a good bit of preparation. And so Jesus sends two of his disciples to go find the house. And the Gospels of Mark and Luke tell us that they go into the city looking for a man carrying a jug of water, and they're to follow that man. And when they get to that house, they're to tell the householder that Jesus is coming and they would like to celebrate the Passover meal there. And so, of course, there's the upper room and the table from the painting, but probably Jesus and the disciples were more like reclining on cushions on the floor or on low kind of sofas instead of sitting behind a table, but that probably wouldn't have worked as well in the painting. This Seder would have been, all the preparations that were required, the foods that were required would have been well known to the householder and to the two disciples who the Gospel of Luke identifies as Peter and John. And so they come to the Passover meal, and in the evening, because it was the first day of unleavened bread, which was one particular observance that took place in the Passover festival, which lasted many days. All right, and remember too, in the Jewish calendar, the day starts out sundown the day before, and so they waited for sundown, and then they went in the evening to have the Passover meal. And at this point, we have the first identification that Jesus knows Judas is the one who's going to betray him. The other disciples don't realize what's going on, but Jesus points to the whoever put their hand in the bowl of water, which is actually part of the Seder at one point, with him would be the one to betray him. But the disciples are probably enjoying themselves at this point. Remember, they don't really realize what's going to be happening, even though Jesus has told them. But they're not paying a whole lot of attention until that point comes where we have the Last Supper. As part of the Seder, Jesus took some bread and he broke it and he passed it and he gave it new meaning to them. That this bread is the bread of life. And then he took the cup. There are 4 cups of wine. There are 4 different times in the Seder when you drink wine. And he took one of those cups of wine and he drank from it and then shared it with all of the disciples, saying, "This is my blood poured out for you." And of course, that's today the whole basis for our celebration of the Eucharist. And at that point, then they sing a hymn. I always like to point that part out is they sang a hymn before they left. And then they went to the Mount of Olives. Now, as I said, Phyllis and I have been on the Mount of Olives, and I want you to think of it as a very large hill that slopes pretty well down. I mean, you have to walk carefully down that hill, all right? And it's a very tall hill. We can see across almost just most of Jerusalem from there, and particularly the Old City, and you look down across the valley, and there is the Old City with the great walls around it that Jesus entered on that first Palm Sunday. All right, and so as they go from the Mount of Olives, Jesus is telling them, "You're all going to desert me." And everybody says, "No, I'm not." And they go from there down to the Garden of Gethsemane, which is at the sort of the foot of that. Before you cross the plain, you go down to the Garden of Gethsemane, and Jesus takes with him Peter and James and John. And they go into the garden, and this is where Jesus asks God, "Must I go through this?" He asks 3 times in prayer, and it is a very moving scene, a very emotional scene. And what this shows us, I think, so importantly, is the humanity of Jesus. There were some in the early church who said Jesus didn't really suffer on the cross, but we know he did. The descriptions are there. And by the way, that belief was declared heresy, simply because it's not true. But then Judas brings the mob to come and arrest Jesus in the Garden at Gethsemane. And the first image that went through my mind was the old westerns where they come with the guns and the torches, and they're going to break the guy out of jail, or they're going to get him out and go string him up. I think this is a good parallel to what was happening. And we know that whole scene about the ear being cut off, about Judas going up and kissing Jesus as some sort of pretend act of honor. But Jesus is arrested by the crowd, or not even arrested, but just taken by the crowd. And at this point, all of the disciples desert him. And they take him to the house of Caiaphas. This would have been inside the city walls of Jerusalem. So they go from the Garden of Gethsemane across the plain and up and into the city. Now, the interesting thing about this is this was not that far. Sometimes the movies make it look like he went a long way. But they go to the house of Caiaphas, and Caiaphas is the high priest. Now, the high priest was the leader of the temple. And in this point in time, he was really just a government official. But the Sanhedrin are all of the Jewish leaders, and they're at Caiaphas' house, and they want to find a charge they can bring against Jesus that would lead to his death. And so the problem is they can't figure one out. Ultimately, we have a bunch of trumped up charges in there, and they confront Jesus right there and with these charges, and what does he say? And Jesus says nothing. Now, it's important to understand that in Jesus' day, if you chose to say nothing when charges were brought against you, that was automatically a presumption of guilt. And so by him saying nothing, he's not admitting to anything, but they're going to say that, well, he must be guilty. And so they bring a charge of blasphemy against him, even though historical records show that what they charged him with was not considered an actual violation of the law against blasphemy. But what really kind of makes the scene interesting, I think, is that at every point Jesus is quoting their own scriptures back to them. And don't you just know that infuriated them? It's at this point that we come to the scene where Peter is out in the courtyard outside of the house, and people start to recognize him, and he denies knowing Jesus. And at that point, then, apparently feeling like they've got everything under control, they decide to wait until the morning and take Jesus to Pontius Pilate. Now, the final scene in this first part is Judas realizing he has made a critical mistake. And he goes and he wants to the temple authorities, and he wants to say to them, "I'll give the money back," but they, of course, have no interest in taking it. And Judas goes out and hangs himself. And they take the 30 pieces of silver, and they go out and buy a field that belonged to a potter. And that's how we came up with today's potter's field, where poor persons and are buried who have no one to take care of their funeral arrangements. Tomorrow we pick up with the trial of Jesus before Pontius Pilate and the crucifixion. I hope you have a good afternoon.